Hey everyone, I hope you're all well. I'm Stephen Morland here. In our last episode, we talked about the importance of innovation, and we talked to construction providers about emerging materials, innovation in design and delivery, and how that can help drive towards net zero. We very much focused on the hardware, and today we're going to shift to the software and the role of technology for a greener and cleaner future. My guest is Matti Jäti, Chief Sustainability Officer for CGI here in the UK. Matti was former head of sustainability at DEFRA, which is part of the UK government, has worked with the United Nations, as well as consultancy experience. She is a PhD specialising in corporate sustainability and a tutor at University of Oxford of Climate Change Programme. Matti was recently announced in the top 100 sustainability power leaders and was the chair of E-Sustainability Alliance, a forum for 300 plus technology companies working to make the UK information and technology sector more sustainable. So perfect for our conversation today on how the technology sector can become more sustainable and how technology can support society in accelerating towards a sustainable future. So welcome, Matti. And I think it'd be really great if you could just share a little bit of background, a little bit more about CGI, if that works for you.
Yes, it does. And I hope you can hear me okay. I see you're nodding, so you can hear me okay. So just a little bit about CGI. CGI was founded in 1976. We are 45/46 years old. We operate globally in 400 locations in 40 countries, from the Americas to Europe and Africa, Asia and Oceania. We have about 90,000 consultants, and we are a 12 billion in revenue Canadian dollars organization. We have about 5,500 clients who are benefiting from our end-to-end services, and about 170 plus IP solutions serving over 50,000 clients. We do everything from satellite and space, and hence our partnership with AI Dash, to integrating solutions, servers, data centers, consultancy in pretty much all of the industries and sectors. So that's just a little bit about CGI. I have prepared some slides for you to talk you through a little bit more about our sustainability credentials, as well as our thinking on the technology front.
Wonderful, thank you. And before we do that, I remember that back in November time you went to COP27. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what was achieved there actually. So we kind of break today down into, I guess, three themes. One on Matti's thoughts on COP27, and then we'll talk a little bit about CGI and the sustainability pathway that you guys are on. And then we'll ask a bit more around how we can support wider society through software solutions. But I'd love to get your thoughts on what was achieved at COP27.
Yeah, COP27 was really interesting. Just some background for those that may not be aware of what CGI was doing in this space. You may not have picked up in the media, but we had partnered with the host nation as well as the UN bodies to demonstrate the role of technologies for climate action. Not just mitigation, as in the reduction of emissions, but also on the adaptation front. How do we adapt as society, as communities, from agriculture to just in general industry, to the nature of climate change, whether that's heating, flooding. How do we adapt as society to what's happening around us, to our environment, whether that's depletion of the environment as well. And so we set out to work with our partners to showcase what technology can do on this front. But beyond that, there was a wider conversation about what do nations and societies need to do, as well as businesses, NGOs, and the role that they play in all of that. So I think there were three key outcomes of COP27 from the perspective of the event itself. The first one being that the Sharm implementation plan, which was negotiated on the 20th of November, so at the very, very end of COP, reaffirmed the commitment for not just nations, businesses, but everybody in the world to limit global temperatures to the rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius pre-industrial levels. That's a huge achievement. I think for a long time, everybody's been talking about 2 degrees Celsius or even 2.5 or 3 degrees Celsius. When you do your scenario analysis for those that are involved in this industry and sector, you soon realize that there are different outcomes and pathways to the different trajectories, 1.5, 2 degrees, 2.5, and so forth. So the 1.5 degree was a huge success and achievement in itself in terms of reaffirming that across the nations that have agreed to adopt that. I think the second part of it, which was very much the centerpiece of COP, was finance, which was right at the heart of it. How do we finance climate action globally? But also the main headline being the agreement to compensate nations for loss and damage caused by climate change through an establishment of a fund, essentially. Now, again, that was a huge achievement for some of you that were listening to the news and the telly. It was absolutely huge for us to hear that, wow, there's this agreement on loss and damage and compensation for nations that have been hugely impacted by climate change. I think the journey to how we get there is going to be interesting in terms of what that does to commitments. I mean, you know, does that give you the right to produce more emissions, therefore, if you are contributing to this fund? You know, there are all sorts of questions that I've began asking myself since, you know, are we giving people essentially a free pass to doing the wrong thing just because they are contributing to this fund? So I think what I'm trying to say is the terms very much surrounding how this fund operates in itself, but also who and how the contributions happen will be very interesting to see as they evolve. And of course, the third part, or the significant part of it, was the progress on adaptation. And this is basically more than 230 million of new pledges, $1 million that is, of new pledges were made to the adaptation fund itself. So that's a separate other achievement in itself. So some really huge successes for COP27, but anyway, I'll pause there, Steve, because there are some other thoughts.
Could you just explain a little bit about, I mean, we seem like every year there's another COP and there's a statement made. We seem to reaffirm, you know, are we still on track for 1.5 degrees, yes or no? And that's a very positive thing that comes out. But I'm curious as to how does the process work? Because they make an announcement, but that doesn't mean it's actually, they're still got to then implement it. So I think what was interesting about this one, and that announcement about loss and damages, that's been kind of discussed for 30 years. That's the thing which is quite surprising about it. What was your biggest surprise? Was that the biggest surprise for you in terms of that actually been agreed? I know it still needs to be implemented, but was that a big key moment, a takeaway that the world's coming together on these kind of issues now?
I'm smiling because I'm thinking, Steve, you want to get me into trouble now.
I'm not.
No. So what was the biggest surprise? I think if we take a few steps back to COP26, and by then I was in government myself. I worked for the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs for 8 years. And just also in a way, I will also answer your question around what's the process and sort of what happens then. But taking it back to COP26, where the Glasgow Climate Pact was agreed, and essentially that included strengthened efforts on building resilience then, as well as strengthened our approach to curbing greenhouse gas emissions and to provide the necessary finance. So that discussion happened then in terms of, right, in its broadness, these are the sort of areas we need to cover. There was then the Paris Rulebook that provided some rules and agreement and guidance on enhanced transparency frameworks for reporting emissions, common frameworks for emissions reporting, reductions and targets in order to get a standardized approach. And also the mechanisms and standards for international carbon markets. I'll move on to the other things, and then we'll begin to unpack where we've come from in terms of COP26, COP27, just to bring this to life a little bit more. And then in terms of the other agreements, being the commitments on forests, methane, car emissions, and private finance. And of course, forests is something that we are already looking at from an AI and CGI perspective, where about 137 countries committed to halting and reversing forest loss and land degradation by 2030. And then phasing out of coal for energy production was another key objective for that presidency, where 190 countries agreed to phase down coal power, resulting in like a 76% decrease, if I remember correctly. I mean, over 40 countries and several states organizations declared to support that. And then, of course, the achievement/agreement, which aimed to decarbonize shared sort of shipping routes for 22 countries that had signed that. But if you look at all of this, for example, from COP26 to where we are, some of these targets are sometimes legally binding. Some of these are not legally binding. And therefore, when you look at areas such as coal, for example, there's already been quite a lot of reversals on that in light of what's happening with the crisis in terms of Russia and Ukraine and the impact that that's had on our energy, for example. And where you've read in the news, many nations that had made that pledge as part of COP26 going into COP27, well, actually, there's been some reverses that have been made, and primarily due to a lack of investment in renewable energy by many sectors, by many nations, and that's made many stakeholders realize what needs to happen really in order to get us to achieve net zero by 2050, which is ultimately our goal. I think areas such as forestry, I can see a huge acceleration in that space, obviously aided by technology and innovations that are able to identify many aspects of forestry, whether that is soils, whether that is the carbon capture elements, whether that is actually the area, if it's deforested and so forth. I think technology is really supporting the acceleration of how we can halt damage and loss and depletion from that lens. in the spaces of, for example, transparency in the frameworks and consistent reporting, well, actually, if you remember, the TCFD was a result of one of the COPs. I believe it was COP21 that initially discussed the TCFD and a need to report on climate-related risks and disclose on those risks alongside finance. It is 2023 now. COP21 was probably a couple of years ago. 2023 now, and in the UK, it is now mandated. You know, every organization has to follow the TCFD, and they have to report on that. I know it will be landing in Canada fairly soon. I believe it's 2024, and a few other nations. The CSRD, which is the new legislation in the EU that is requiring and asking of many organizations to report not just on climate, but on nature alongside finance, has already landed. And so you can almost see from the conversations that happen at COP, the agreements that happen there, and then how they are implemented in different ways across different nations. And so with one lens, I know people go to COP and generally say, well, actually, it's almost become a talking shop and so forth. But we really must pay attention in terms of what are they discussing at COP, because ultimately it will manifest itself in a different way. And there is an opportunity for all of us to shape those conversations in a way that we can all play our role in that.
Thank you for that. That's super, actually. Because I think you're right. I could have gone down the route of saying, was anything really achieved, and is it a talking shop? But I think what you've demonstrated there is actually that the power of the consistency of reporting is very important. So everybody's doing everything in the same way, that you can then start to monitor and realize whether or not, you know, somebody is doing more or less. But it does take time from when it's agreed to how it's implemented. What was your? I mean, I turn it around into what's missing. What is still yet to be achieved through the future COPs? What has not been done?
This is a really good and very broad question. I think COP is primarily focused on climate, and I think the previous COPs have, and quite rightly so, they've focused on mitigation. The language has shifted slightly to adaptation and climate justice. But also I do think that we do need to address that. Well, how do we develop a consistent way of whether that is reporting on your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. I think the SBTI have done a great job by producing guidance and some level of standardization around how organization can achieve their reductions in a science-based target way. But there is need for that consistency around going back to COP26 and a few other COPs that have already highlighted transparency frameworks, but also common frameworks for emissions reductions. And I think the GHG does this very well, but as you go further down the tiers into the granularity of, well, actually, what unit measure do I use? You know, those sorts of questions. And actually, well, one organization is using one unit measure versus another is using another. How do you develop that level of comparability? I think nature was huge as part of COP26. I think it would be good to accelerate that more, but appreciate COP15, which is the nature equivalent of the COP26 and so forth, has addressed nature and how we can halt loss and damage. But I think these two conversations could take place also under one single umbrella, from the perspective of natural capital reporting and actually having a joint united face when it comes to challenging the the equations and the economics of how we are measuring success as nations at this point in time, i.e. GDP and so forth. So I think in order to truly address those conversations of what does wealth mean in the context of a country and a nation, we do need to have holistic conversations around value and all the other topics, monetization and unit measures and so forth. How do we incorporate all of these alongside GDP and other things like that?
Terrific, thank you. I'm going to move on from COP, but thank you very much for that insight. I'm fascinated. We could spend the entire hour talking about COP27, but I'm super keen to jump into, how the technology sector becomes more sustainable and what it means to a technology company. So, it's good to see that things seem to be progressing, and I think you provide a very positive insight to how the COP process works. I think when we see it from afar, we see that the protesters complaining, and we see to an extent, I'm curious by the way as to are folks just getting on with it anyway? Are we making progress? We saw since Paris that there's been climate emergency pledges, organizations going ahead of legally binding targets. So the sort of cynic could say, are people just getting fed up with COP and just getting on with it anyway? But that may just be my perception, and maybe biased by a very Western perspective on these things. But I'm curious as to, let's move on to the tech sector. I read a stat, it said up to 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions are now related to the energy demands, particularly around data centers and technology companies. We often get a little bit of bad press, particularly with the rise of new technologies. Bitcoin in particular has, I think it's 0.3% of global emissions, which is incredible. So, there's a bit about how do we get our own house in order for software and for technology. And what's your view on this? What's the role of technology, and what are the kind of challenges that we face within this sector itself?
Oh, wow. Again, another big topic there, Steve. I think if we break down the role of technology into three very simple areas, and I don't know what sort of an audience we have today, so I'll try to aim to keep things simple. In that we have the environment pillar, we have the economic pillar, and we have the social pillar. On the environment side, we typically talk about how do we reduce waste, for example, or how do we become more efficient as organizations, whether you are a technology organization or a general organization. How do you reduce your emissions? How do we invest in nature and biodiversity? And then also we look at the social side of sustainability from the perspective of modern slavery and the legislation underpinning that, whether that's the UK or anywhere where you are in the world, human rights, forced labor, child labor. Our investment in communities, STEM, digital inclusion, and the wider topics around social, the communities in which we operate and so forth. And then, of course, we also have the economic side of sustainability, which is actually, well, there's two lenses to this. Organizations that are looking to make a profit, but how do they also invest in things like research and development, innovation, and obviously topics such as natural capital or capital in accounting come into that economic pillar. So the way I look at them is in two lenses. There's your internal environment, and then there's your external environment, as in external to an organization or external to you as an individual and a person. With regards to your internal environment, you are very much looking at how can you as an organization become more responsible, become more sustainable. And remember those two are two very different topics as well. One fits in the other is my belief. But how do you as an organization do the right thing, and do the right thing by your communities, by your society, by all of these targets that we have, by your clients, by your partners, and those you've already highlighted. So from a CGI perspective, for example, we do have data centers, we have software, we build and support the development of laptops, and in our supply chain we've got organizations like Dell Technologies that provide us with these devices, which we then proceed to connect for our clients and so forth. And not forgetting the industry we're in, Steve, space, satellites, they're all built using materials and resources and different sorts of critical raw materials and precious metals. And so from that context, we do need to think about, as an industry ourselves, what sort of standards are we placing on ourselves to make sure that we are also doing the right things? Are we ensuring supply chain due diligence? Are we holding those that we do business with to high standards to make sure that the things that they're providing us with, they've thought about where they're coming from? Are we aiding and supporting conflict in countries that are already struggling with wars, or countries that are already being depleted of resources, whether that's gold, tin, tantalum, and so forth? But as an organization, are we polluting? Are we polluting the communities in which we operate, the rivers, the oceans, but also what are we doing about empowering communities and societies? So there is that role for technology to play in itself, to look within itself as an industry to see what we are doing and how we are having an impact, whether that's positively or negatively on ourselves, but also on the communities in which we operate. Then from an external environment perspective, well, actually, that's a big world, as you know. Technology has a massive role to capture data and information and provide useful insights that can be used to make better decisions on the direction of policy, on the direction of decisions that organizations and stakeholders can make. For example, the use of satellites to monitor nature or to quantify carbon emissions, or the use of technology to develop transparent supply chains through the use of blockchain, for example, or the use of technology to forecast and make predictions through machine learning and AI, to help us build better resiliency in our activities and our operations. But also the ability to help us communicate from a well-being perspective, how we interact with each other. We saw through the pandemic that actually it was technology that kept most of us going and most of us engaged in some way, shape, or form. So there's that element of well-being, or the opportunities for technology to reduce travel, and of course balancing that with the need to have face-to-face interactions with others. So two lenses really, internal, external, and the final lens is, I always say, is about insights and data. I think technology's role is largely about providing the data, the insights, in order to help different actors, different activities make sound decisions, and therefore progress in the right way.
Thank you. No, that's perfect. And what do you see? I mean, do you see that as I was going to ask you about how CGI has got its own sustainability consultancy arm. So that kind of natural link from measuring yourself and using your own data and your own capabilities to understand where your own sustainable challenges are. And I think you've described a very broad range of topics there, from climate change to nature loss to waste management through to societal sustainability and positive impact. So doing it for yourself, it positions you quite well then for providing the same solution to others through their data, and how you, if you're doing data integration or data management for them, then I mean, what's your thoughts here? Is that the reason why it seemed when we first met, and we started talking, my natural perception is it's a tech company, but what's a tech company doing with sustainability consultancy? That's a bit different. So how did that come about? Was it as I described, that it was you doing it for yourself, and actually you're quite well positioned to serve a broader marketplace?
It's a really good question. So I think just tracking back to when we were founded as a technology company, we always held the principles of communities and societies in which we operate. So I think it's interesting when you look back at the journey of sustainability professionals, or even sustainability itself. I won't take you back to many years ago, because that's going to reveal my age, but but if you for example, let's take the Brundtland Commission, Brundtland report. For those that may not be familiar with it, 1987, the UN held a convention, which they then held again in 1992 at Rio, where the notion of sustainable development really, I don't want to say was created, but began to really take off and accelerate, and the notion of many countries coming together. So at that point, it was really about sustainable development, and sustainability wasn't really sustainability then, except for a few people and professionals that had the passion for this topic. But also progressing through the years, companies have always wanted to do the right thing. Most companies have always invested in community activities, whether that is, I know back in the day, I used to help organizations that wanted to enter different markets, or different organizations, and for example, wanted to invest in an orphanage, or wanted to invest in an aspect of community. They didn't know it then, but that was sustainability back then. It was the nice thing, it was the right thing to do, and actually companies just did it because they were very close to the topic, or a CEO, somebody in the organization was always very close to that topic and wanted to do something good and have some impact in the communities and societies. And then the topic of pollution really accelerated, especially in developing worlds. And at the time, I worked really closely with Swiss companies who were very pro or very anti companies that were opening businesses in different parts of the world, and then ended up polluting. And primarily the courts in Switzerland were always busy in terms of those international cases that they had seen, with communities taking many organizations to court because of they've polluted our rivers, or the mining companies that they're working with are producing a lot of emissions and so forth. Again, that was an element of sustainability. I think what's happened now is that we're a lot more aware of it. Our societies have evolved to become a lot more conscious. There is a high level of expectations on businesses and individuals now, and actually the practice and the industry itself has evolved professionally, in that we are able to say, no, that's environment, that's social, that's economic. But even with those three pillars, we're able to challenge them and say, is that it? Are those the only three pillars? Is there a better way of looking at those three pillars? Maybe let's take a Capito's approach and take human, social, financial, and so forth. So the industry and the sector of sustainability has evolved, and actually I think we've made quite a lot of progress in terms of evolving our language and communication of this topic so that it is more relatable for businesses and organizations. I think still a way to go in terms of there's a lot of work that's being done now from the perspective of finance and economics, which I'm very passionate about, and bringing that language into those sectors as they have a really big role to play. I think a lot still needs to happen in terms of supply chain and what we can do as far as the role of technology there. But I do think, as we've evolved, societies, businesses have also just evolved with the topic.
Yeah. How does why a technology company that providing sustainability consultancy, is it what uniquely positions CGI to do that? I mean, as you said, you work with, I think you said 50,000 clients, which is a colossal number of clients. But I'm just curious, because the origins of the company were very different. It was around data. There was a consultancy arm naturally around software integration and data management. I'm just curious how that evolved into providing, and I think this, you kind of answered a part of it already about data management, but I'm trying to think about what helped navigate CGI towards this particular capability.
Yeah, I think I'll probably answer it in a different way, Steve, in your earlier question around consultancy and tech. You know, how do the two sort of go hand in hand, and how do they work together? And that will potentially then begin to answer some of your questions. So technology, naturally, when you look at the different solutions that are out there, whether it is sensors, whether it's machine learning and so forth, at the core of it, they're able to capture data, they're able to capture information, they're able to provide useful insights on what can be done as far as different organizations are concerned. If you look at areas such as estates that use the BMS systems, everybody will just say, well, it's the BMS system that we use to manage our estates and our property, and it captures all sorts of information. Well, actually, that's underpinned by technology. That's pulling information from different parts of your estates and organization. You know, are your ventilations working? Do you have the relevant data in place in order to inform whether you're consuming a lot of energy as an organization? Where do you need to switch off the lights and turn them back on? Where do you need to rationalize your estates and properties and strategy in order to gain efficiencies in others? That's just one area and one good example of where technology itself is providing useful information and insights and so forth. But also then where there has always been a gap is that people don't often understand technology and what is possible with it. And so when you merge the two together in terms of being able to provide people, stakeholders, colleagues with advice and guidance on how specific technologies work, how to evolve them, how to adapt them, how to deploy them in the right way, and potentially where there are gaps. Are you missing a trick here? And really asking those key fundamental questions around where there are other opportunities to gain efficiencies. That, you know, goes sort of hand in hand. And so being able to provide organizations with insights or information on how to reduce and quantify their emissions, for example, capturing those emissions, the emissions data, the information that that they have within the organizations, alongside their activities, alongside their processes, that all of that will ultimately involve some element of knowledge of and understanding of technology, whether that is the BMS system or whether that is actually just want to quantify emissions from your agriculture sector. How do you do that? You know, you need tools to do that. So it's that element of science, math, data, you know, engineering, and being able to pull all of that together. And of course, there's a bit of art as well. And so all of that together, actually, that is everything about sustainability. It's science, it's math, it's data, it's all of that. So really the two sectors just align. And so being able to evolve from one to another is quite natural, but also, as I've highlighted and touched on, societies are now requiring more of companies and organizations. And so again, that gap with where people, organizations need help in terms of understanding their impact, or understanding how they could play a role. Of course, that is also another driver.
Wonderful, thank you. I'll summarize that as being, it's about providing data from control systems and turning it into something simple that somebody can make a decision on. It's taking all that complexity and turning it into, what do I need to, how do I prioritize, where do I start, what's it going to cost me, what options I can play with, and which ones I should do first. I'm going to turn into some questions which we had from the audience, and I would love if there's any other questions coming from the chat. I don't know if Evan, if you picked up any additional ones, but we had a few in advance, which I've highlighted a few. We'll go through all of them. I think we've touched on some of them already, but so let me start with this one. Actually the question was, can we define all inputs for scope 1, 2, 3 emissions? But I like to think of it as, can we define and use tech to help us identify the inputs to scope 1, 2, and 3? Maybe it's the third one I'm really thinking of, and track through the supply chain with accuracy, right? So is that possible now? Can we do that? Because we tend to take averages or proxies for scope 3 emissions, but how far through the supply chain can we go now?
Oh, that's a very, very big question. And thank you to the person that's asked that question. So just to reiterate, please do put your questions in the chat if you have any. So let's start off with scope 1 and 2. So we're talking about direct and indirect emissions here. In terms of, you know, you look at the operators or the energy companies, I mean, and thankfully CGI is very involved in the smart metering rollout. So houses will have a smart meter. If you don't have a smart meter, your energy consumption, you are inputting, for example, your meter readings and so forth into a portal somewhere, where your energy provider takes that and then converts that into what your consumption is and bills you for all of that. So as the reason I'm articulating and sharing that is because not only is it powered, for example, by technology, there is some element of technology capturing that, but as you can see, you can quantify quite easily your scope 1 and 2. Most of it is you either are able to capture it real time for those organizations that will have smart meters or stakeholders. Some of it, you will have your meters there that will provide you with actually that's where you were yesterday, this is where you are now. That's providing you some sort of intelligence and information that you're inputting somewhere. So you are able to quantify and capture all of these. As you go into scope 3, you enter some very tricky and interesting areas. So for example, if you look at purchased goods and services, let's give the example of the laptop you're currently looking at the moment, or the mobile phone you're using at the moment. Sometimes it is very difficult for you to get real-time information on how much energy or how you're producing emissions through your use of those technologies. There's different measures. For example, for your laptops and mobile phones, you can either estimate it by, you know, your manufacturer will have provided you with information of how much it takes to, for example, recharge your mobile phone and your laptop. You know, typically to recharge my phone, if it's on completely zero, that would take about 6 watts of energy within a year. And when you break that down to the granularity of how much that would take per charge, you're looking at the 0.0 something, but typically we say about 6 watts or so. And so when you begin to quantify that in terms of, if you're an organization that has 10,000 people, and you know the unit measure, for example, of how much you consume through your laptop, mobile phone, you can make some fairly accurate estimations. You know, 100 people multiplied by 6 watts multiplied by 4 years, or if it's 1 year or whatever it is. There's some areas you can, you know, for example, business travel and commuting is also a part of Scope 3. And so some organizations are great at collecting that data and information through their various systems. Some people use invoices. They have to claim back their expenses. If they did travel and the company would compensate them, but within that they have to. And so with all of that, that's information and data, again, that you have that can be used to quantify the emissions of an organization. When you look at different areas such as leased assets or investments, again, there is some element of quantification you can work out. Typically, most organizations use, which I'm sorry to say this for those that are listening, most organizations use the spend data, which is basically just to quantify their spend on a particular service or a particular product, and then convert that into emissions. In the simplest ways is the way I'm describing it. But that becomes a problem when you actually need to demonstrate real reductions, because your spend is just taking a standard, you know, figure of I have, but it's not really real time. So how do you, you know, demonstrate, not even real time, it's not even estimated. You've not even made the effort to understand what assets or what activities are happening in order for you to actually demonstrate real reductions. So the aim really with Scope 3 is great. You can start off with your spend data, but as you progress, you do need to start thinking about how do you refine that a bit more.
Terrific. And let me ask you another one then. So there's a great question here, which is how do we address the waste that is created from technology? Which I thought was a terrific question, a hard question. And I don't know what the example should be. The mobile phones are pretty obvious ones, right? I guess it's must be billions of mobile phones now around the world. But yeah.
Yeah. So how do we address waste from the technology? This is I think most people look at the end result of what we've produced. We've got waste. It's you know, we've sent it to landfill. It's become waste at that point. But actually, there is a life cycle of waste. And with that life cycle, there are different points within that life cycle where decisions can be made to avoid our IT or whatever object we're looking at becoming waste. So let's take the example of the way we manufacture some of our products and solutions. We manufacture them and produce them in such a way that actually no one can do anything about it. That IP is ours, it belongs to our company, and therefore we do not want anyone to touch it, to fix it, to repair it, to tamper with it in any way, shape, or form. And therefore, at its end of its life cycle, you know, 3, 4 years, 5 years, it's just obsolete. Nobody can do anything with it. It's off it goes, you know, to landfill. So there's that decision there. Well, actually, what can manufacturers and producers do at the beginning of the designing phase of these products and services to make sure that they are designed in a way that that is considering sustainability upfront at the design phase. But then as you progress into the different phases, for example, software is a good one. You know, some companies upgrade their softwares every 3-4 years, which forces you to move and upgrade your device to the software that is compatible with that device. And so, well, actually, what can we do about that? You know, what can a company do about, or the manufacturers or the owners of the software do about making sure that that software is designed with sustainability in mind as well? So there are many phases of that life cycle, how we distribute things, how we take care of things, accessories that we place around the items that we have to make sure they're looked after and that we're giving them a longer life. How do we give things a second life and a third life? How do we remanufacture these laptops and refurbish them so that they are nice and new and are good to go for another 2-3 years and 4 years? So I think there are many things that can be done in order to avoid being waste early on.
Terrific, wonderful. There's a quick question too in here. I'm not quite sure if this is really the right place for it, but are you aware of whether there are any commitments on grid decarbonisation in the UK at any of the COPs? I don't know if that was more of the Committee on Climate Change kind of question rather than.
Yeah, grid decarbonisation in the UK. So I don't think this is just specifically for the UK, but there are grid decarbonisation commitments. I would need to look up what they are, to be honest, because I wouldn't want to tell you something that is wrong. But there are commitments that organisations and nations have placed as a result of COP. And they are in many different areas in terms of whether that's renewable energy and the adoption and use of solar energy. There are countries that have made commitments to accelerate their use of renewable energy. I know the host nation last year, COP27, they've made a pledge to move to, I think it's something like 75 or 80% renewable energy that will be that they will have as a nation, and ultimately for the grid, and ultimately that's going to decarbonize their industries. So, but I do see why you've asked that question as well, in terms of it is an area that needs to be explored a lot more as part of COPs. And I think it's definitely an area that needs to be invested more because it's such a shame, and it is a missed opportunity when we have all of this wonderful resource and all of this innovation out there that can turn our energy into clean energy and green energy.